So welcome to this We Are seminar series. This is the kind of macro international trade kind of part of the series, and we are delighted to kick it off today with Chang, who is currently at Virginia. She just finished her PhD at UCLA, and she's working on very interesting issues related to international finance, and in particular, this paper is going to be about foreign exchange intervention. So Chang, hey, do I pronounce your name well or not?
No, it's actually just a French way. It's Chang. It's like you have to go.
Okay,
yes. No problem, no problem, Helen. Thank you for being so nice. Well, thanks for invitation. Really happy to meet everyone. So I'm really new. I just finished my PhD like a few months ago, and yeah, I'm really happy, excited to be here to talk about my paper. This is the paper I went on with the market, entitled Inelastic Financial Markets and Foreign Exchange Interventions. So I will start talking and you guys can ask questions on the go. Just feel free to interrupt me. I think that'll be more efficient if I explain the doubts on the way. Okay, and Helen will be monitoring the chat, right? If you have questions in the chat as well. Okay, let me start. So foreign exchange interventions, which typically define as a central bank buying or selling international reserves through the open market operations, is a key policy tool for the central bank to intervene with exchange rates. Interventions can happen in large magnitudes, and they happen in both crisis and normal times. Given how large scale and frequent those interventions are, a key policy question to ask through the macro finance perspective is that do these interventions work at all, or are they effective at stabilizing exchange rates? Well, if you look at standard textbook macro models, so those are the models that we teach undergrad students and also which we teach in the first day macro PhD sequence. So those type of models typically assume that financial markets are perfectly elastic in a sense that home and foreign assets perfect substitutes, and the financial markets therefore uncover interest parity condition codes. In this regard, an intervention would simply be a reshuffling of assets between home and foreign assets, and it would therefore have no traction on exchange rates at all. However, if you look at the asset pricing literature, they paint a very different story. They say that home and foreign assets far from being perfect substitutes, and the financial market is far from being perfectly elastic. But therefore, from an asset pricing point of view, we have evidence to believe that interventions do have traction on exchange rates. With that in mind, let me introduce the research question of this paper, which is exactly how effective are foreign exchange interventions at stabilizing exchange rates? Well, it turns out this is actually a very challenging question to answer empirically, precisely because intervention typically happen during the financial crisis, or can happen both in crisis and normal times. But in other words, the macro fundamentals, exchange rates, and intervention itself are jointly endogenous. If we were to run a regression of changing exchange rates on the intervention side, it's a very plain vanilla OS. Such regression would produce a zero coefficient. For example, if the intervention really works perfectly to stabilize exchange rates all the way to a constant level. That said, to really causally unravel the effects of intervention on exchange rates, we need a natural experiment that exogenously shift the demand and the government's composition of government bonds in the economy and being independent macro fundamentals. Here, I highlighted the words exogenous and currency composition because I want to distinguish the buying and selling of reserves from the central banks. So we want a demand shock on just local currency versus the foreign currency government bonds that moves exchange rates. So what do we do in this paper? We ask the question, how effective are foreign exchange interventions at stabilizing exchange rates? To do so, we leverage from the mechanical rebalancings of the largest local currency government bonds index for emerging countries. This index called GBIM Global Diversified, which I'm going to speak in detail in a few slides. We show that the mechanical rebalancings of an index create exogenous currency demand shock, moves exchange rates, and provides support for inelastic financial markets model. by markets being inelastic simply mean that exchange rates or asset prices are super responsive to a flow, such as the currency demand shock or index rebalancing. So using this mechanical rebalancing as a natural experiment, we identified the elasticity of exchange rates in response to the currency demand shock. And then through the lens of an inelastic financial markets model, we estimate the counterfactual required size of intervention to stabilize exchange rates for a group of emerging countries in my sample. So what did we find? Here's a few highlights of results. So first, we find the currency demand shock moves exchange rates both in the short and long run significantly. In the short run, a 1 cent deviation of the shock, which is about 0.6 billion US dollar flows, moves exchange rates for about 1.2%. This is for a median country, for example. The 0.6 billion US dollar flows, it could be a small number for a developed countries or US economy. However, note that we're using the emerging market sovereign bonds market. So it's actually a pretty big number for this market. The 0.6 billion US dollars is actually about the size of issuance, of monthly issuance sovereign bonds for a median country in my sample, such as Colombia. Okay, and we show that the effects are not so transitory. This currency demand shock have a rather persistent impact on exchange rates that lasts for significant, at least 3 months, with the reversal back to mean that lasts for about 1 year. The fact that exchange rates are responsive to the currency demand shock provides support the financial markets are inelastic. And the inelastic financial markets, foreign exchange interventions work as additional policy instrument to stabilize exchange rates without compromising monetary policy interest rate, regardless of the capital control policies. In other words, we provide empirical evidence that relaxes the classical tri-level condition from Mendel-Fleming. We also show that the more inelastic financial markets are, the more effective foreign exchange interventions are. So here, the floaters are the more inelastic financial markets than the peggers. And by effective intervention policies simply mean that those countries need less amount of US reserves to move exchanges by the same amount. If you want some numbers, so we find that a 1% appreciation of exchange rates will lead to about 0.1% GDP. 1% appreciation would require central bank to sell reserves that worth about 0.1% GDP. This is for average effects for emerging countries in my sample. So this number is rather in a similar magnitude as the event studies on emerging countries' foreign exchange interventions, and is relatively in a similar scale as the demand estimation papers on currency elasticity, such as some Helene's paper on the topic. Okay, I think this may be a good point to stop to ask if there's any questions.
Yeah, so I was wondering, I have a couple of questions so far.
Sure.
So I was wondering first, when you estimate your currency demand shock and the effect on the exchange rate, so do you see any nonlinear effect? So when you have this rebalancing of a bond due to the mechanical inclusion in the index, I assume you have some which have very large flows and some which have less large flows. And
yeah,
does it? Do you see any kind of nonlinearity in the exchange rate effects? And is it explained, I don't know, by the shallowness of the markets, or did you look at all into the heterogeneity?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. Sorry, should I take your second question now, or I answer this question?
Well, I can ask after. I mean, so.
Oh, okay. No, this is a very interesting question. So it's great. Yeah, so I did consider that. So this is a great point. So what Helen, basically, if I understand you correctly, is that a $2 billion US for Brazil would be different for Peru, Argentina, right? Because the country size is different. And we do capture that. So the demand shock I'm actually measuring in the paper, which I'm going to show in detail in a few slides, is scaled by the size of the country. But the size of a country is the weight of a country in index, which I will be very specific when we go to the equations. But yeah, so I would say, so the short answer to the question, yes, those are unlinear. They're definitely nonlinear because, you know, there's heterogeneous impacts. And so we find that even if you consider the size of a country, there's still heterogeneity in the response across countries. And
but when you
and that's the finding here. That's the elasticity of the currency, which is driven by the regimes of exchange rate and volatility. So even if you control for the size of the market, there's still another additional dimension of heterogeneity that's driven by the currency regimes or exchange rate regimes.
Okay, so when you say size, it's the size of a bond market, it's not the GDP.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
I would say I checked both. So I checked out the response. So I think in the paper, this version I'm going to present right now in the slides, so it's still by the size of the bond market, right? But I did robustness check when I checked the size of GDP. I don't think it's in the slides here, but yeah, they have very similar impact. So I would say the size, either by GDP or scaling by the bonds market, they yield similar results, the empirical finding.
Right.
Thank you.
And the second question, if I may, but feel free to postpone it, is when you compare free floaters and peggers, but the thing is with peggers, people know that if there is a pressure to appreciate, there's going to be an intervention by definition, right? So unlike for floaters, which there may or may not be an intervention. So it's not strictly comparable, those two exchange rate regimes.
Yes. So this question, yeah, thanks for the question. So I understand you're basically thinking about these two countries' regimes is very different, right? So one, the peggers, they're just, endogenously, the policy more responsive to any exchange rate shocks. So I did consider that in the paper. So basically what I'm saying here, I'm just arguing that the elasticity I'm estimating is really like a clean identification in the sense that this is, the government interventions are not responsive to this currency demand shock I'm using. So here I'm estimating the exchange rate change in response to the currency demand shock that's exogenous, which is independent of government interventions. So government interventions could take place, but it will not try to offsetting the impact from the currency demand shock that I have in this empirical setting on the exchange rates. So in other words, the estimation results is purely using exogenous currency demand shock. It's independent from interventions on exchange rates.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Maybe we can revisit a bit later. Why don't you?
Okay. Any more questions before I keep going? All right, so I'll be just concise here. So we speak to a really few important strands of literature on both interventions and foreign exchange interventions and asset pricing and finance. So importantly, I just want to highlight a key contribution of papers that uses a well-employed identification strategy in asset pricing, in particular index rebalancing, to address a policy-relevant macro fundamental question on foreign exchange interventions. And therefore, this bridges to gap on demand-based asset pricing and the policy-relevant papers on intervention policies in macro literature. Okay, so the rest of my talk will be divided into 3 blocks. So first of all, I will talk about the currency demand shock, which is my natural experiment I'm using. I'll be very specific about index rebalancing. So everyone will be on the same page about how I use this currency demand shock. And then I will show you some stylized facts on how the currency demand shock relates with exchange rates and also the interest rate in financial markets which I have evidence to show that they're inelastic. And thirdly, I'm going to go for a Lansing model to draw intervention policy implications. And it's through the Lansing model, I think, Helene, you can see better how to answer your question. I think it would be better if you point to equations. Okay, so let me start with this natural experiment. It's the very exciting part, I think. So this index we're using is called GBIEM Global Diversified. The full name is called Government Bond Index Emerging Market Global Diversified. So it's published by JP Morgan, and it is the largest local currency government bonds index for emerging countries. So it's really the largest in this asset class. So by large, it simply means in terms of assets management. So of the mutual funds for tracking index. If you go to the index in 2019, so JP Morgan reported that there's about 200 billion assets under management for this index. Okay, again, the $200 billion is a huge number for this emerging market sovereign bonds market, because 200 billion is actually bigger than the total issuance sovereign bonds by the emerging markets combined in the same year. Another way to look at the popularity of the index is to go to EPFR dataset, which is a leading mutual fund data provider, as some of you might have known. So if you go to EPFR and you just start counting all the mutual funds for tracking a local currency government bonds index by emerging countries, you'll find that 90% of them are tracking at least, you're tracking a version of GBI yen, which again adds to the popularity of the index. Now, this paper is really based the rebalancing strategy by this JP Morgan at monthly frequency. This is the key identification assumption, or will be used in this paper. In particular, JP Morgan rebalances at last business day of the month, at every month, and caps the weight of each country at 10%. Well, how are the weights constructed? So before we go to the details example, next slide, let me just introduce some notations, make sure we're on the same page. So think about QT, which is the sovereign bonds outstanding of a country. This is the actual macro fundamentals, is QT. And then there's QT hat, which is how much JP Morgan choose to include in index. So again, QT is actual data. QT hat is what JP Morgan choose to include in this index. So larger the QT, the larger the country size, the larger sovereign bonds market, the larger the QT hat will be in the index. Okay, and the larger the weight of the country. And at the rebalancing date, JP Morgan have to cap the weight of each country at 10%. So let's say if a country that's 15, we have to reduce country weight from 15 to 10 and then redistribute the residual weight, which is 15 minus 10, which equals 5, to smaller countries not at a cap, so that everyone's weights add up to 100%. So therefore, in this rebalancing event, some countries' weight increase, others decrease. But not because, or purely as a result, as the mutual funds were tracking the index, have to buy or sell the positions as these weights are increasing or decreasing from the rebalancing. So to capture this weight change, we introduce this currency demand shock, mu CT, which is captured at, sorry, my screen is gone, right? Okay, now it's back. Okay, was captured as weights before and after rebalancing divided by the weights after rebalancing. So this is the currency demand shock we use in this paper. So I'm going to be specific about how I construct this weights before and after next slide. But for now, so this goes back to Helen's first question, which is, do we consider different size of a country? And this is the reason why we're scaling this changing weights by the country's own weight, right? Because $2 billion flow for Brazil be very different for Argentina. And that's why we're scaling by the size of a country, which is the weight of a country index at the rebalancing date. Okay, so let me just give a very specific, yeah, please.
I just have a clarification question. So I understand that there is a constraint on the 10%, but then when you're rebalancing to smaller countries, here there is some degree of freedom, no? So how do they choose which countries are going to benefit from this? Because you seem to take everything as exogenous.
Yeah. So it's going to come on, great question, come next slide. So it's all mechanical. So actually they don't choose. So you seem to suggesting that, right? This portfolio optimization problem that they try to really optimize what interest, but actually there's nothing like that. It's only just computational mechanical, and everyone can replicate that if they know the algorithm. So here's this coming next slide. All right, so I'm going to show you an example of rebalancing, but even before that, let's just see the definition of weights, and we'll move on to that in just 30 seconds. So here, I want to define weights before and after rebalancing, which is moments before weights rebalancing takes place at the rebalancing date, which is the last business day of the month. So here, let's just go through this notation carefully. So the weights before uses the Q hat T minus 1. In other words, you use the face amount in the index from the last rebalancing, and the price today, because we are looking at the rebalancing day today. So in other words, this weights before captures the buy and hold weight of the country if rebalancing did not take place. Since I'm using the face amount from last period and then just roll it over, so I have to adjust it by the returns of the entire index by this month. And since I'm looking at the rebalancing day today, I'm using price PCT. And the weights after simply uses the Q hat at today, so it's QCT hat. So in other words, these weights before and after are conditional on the same price today, that's PCT. In other words, the only difference between them is the face amount in the rebalancing by JP Morgan. And in other words, the changes in weights captures the mechanical part of rebalancing induced by JP Morgan. Okay, so after knowing the weights, let me see an example about rebalancing so that can address Isabel's question. So imagine, okay, just for simplicity, we have 11 countries in index, okay, just for now. And assume that 8 of them are already at the rebalancing threshold, 10%. So let's ignore the other 80% of them, so 100% of them. So we're only look at 20% of them. So that's Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. So let's say I wake up today, everyone else already 10%, so I'll just ignore them for now. And I see that Brazil is doing really well. And a month, my Brazil is 15% weight, Colombia is 4%, Peru is 1%. Well, what can I do? By the JP Morgan rebalancing rule, we have to mechanically reduce Brazil's weight from 15 to 10. And I have to mechanically reshuffle this 5% residual weights to Colombia and Peru proportional to the original weights. So that's back to Isabel's part. So those things this redistribution is highly proportional to countries' original weights. So it must be 4 and 1 because Colombia and Peru's weights are 4/1 in the original proportion. So eventually, all the countries' weights must be either at or below 10%. And once we reach this column, the rebalance is finished. So again, this is a very simplified rebalancing example, but in reality, it could take multiple rounds recursively until all the countries' weights are either at or below 10%, and then we are finished. Okay, let's recap. Any questions? Yes.
No, just sorry, so that I understand.
Please ask me.
If it happened that under this rebalancing, Colombia was now facing the 10% constraint, then the JP Morgan would go to 10, and then the residual would be further allocated across countries, or because
yes, I see your point. I see your point.
Because
Yeah, I see your point. So you're saying that, let's say Colombia was 9, right? And when Brazil decreases, Colombia goes above 10 again. Yes, then it will keep happening recursively until everyone's weights are either at below 10%. So that could happen too. Yes. So that's definitely a possibility. So again, since you're asking, I just want to say another thing. So in this example, I just have one example where, the shock is Brazil being downwards and everything else for the small country is always positive, right? But in fact, there's another rule. It's called a 10-10 staggering rule. They call staggering by JP Morgan, which means that if Brazil reaches 10%, they will stagger Brazil for 10% again in the next period, and for the 10 months ahead of that. So what that means is that, let's say Brazil is 9% next month, because it's 10% at rebalancing day today. Well, next month, even it's 9, I still have to bring it back to 10. So that will trigger a positive shock for Brazil, and then these two, Colombia and Peru, decrease the weights from that rebalancing. So that's a possibility too. It just, I'm just giving a very simplified example here to get the point. Thank you for the question. Okay, so let's recap here for a second about what happened here. So in this example, we see a macro fundamental shock for Brazil because Brazil is doing really well. Its weights bump up to 15%. And such macro fundamental shock to Brazil makes its weights increase. So it hits 10% threshold by the mechanical rule. But it also leads to Colombia and Peru, their weights increase. But not because they're doing better macro fundamental in their countries, but purely because Brazil is having a macro fundamental shock in Brazil's country. In other words, the changes in weights in Colombia and Peru are orthogonal to their own macro fundamentals in their two countries. So that's the key identification assumption we're looking at. So when looking at the currency demand shock, we don't really look at Brazil in our main identification assumption, even though we did include that in our robustness checks. Sorry. So our identifying assumption relies on the fact that the changes in the country weights for the smaller country not at a threshold of 10% are orthogonal to their own macro fundamentals in their country. And we're using those mu CT from this Colombia and Peru as our exogenous currency demand shock that we'll explore in the empirical setting in this paper. So here, I just want to say one thing before anyone asks questions. So even though my example, I just I really shouldn't. I coincidentally picked 3 Latin countries, which Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. So people could ask you, okay, they're all like so correlated, right? But in fact, my sample has like a huge range of countries, different by geographical regions and, you know, the macro policies. So there's also Thailand, Turkey, South Africa. Yeah, so there's a very range of different countries, not just Latin. So rest assured that there's a lot of heterogeneity across macro fundamentals. And we do see, I show that in some robustness check in the paper that macro fundamentals in these countries have very different correlations across time. And again, we're not using one-time shock. We're using a shock that happens monthly frequency over a 15-year horizon. So there's a lot of variation in the sample. So even though if 2 countries have very similar co-movement macro fundamentals in one time, it's hard to guarantee that they will move the exactly same way in every single month. So, so the co-movement macro fundamental will not be a huge issue for the identification in this paper. Okay, I want to see if there's any questions before I move on.
Well, you did check the orthogonality condition using some macroeconomic variables, right?
Yes, for sure. So, I mean, intuitively, so back to Helen's questions. So intuitively, this is a very high frequency shock, right? So you have a monthly frequency and those GDP consumption, all those stuff, intuitive, they're very slow moving. So if you just regress the GDP consumption or even trade variables on my currency demand shock, using the best frequency you could ever get, they don't show any correlation at all. Not for the pool regression, not for country level, nothing shows up significantly.
How about the equity prices?
That, I think that could show up. I don't know. Yeah, so that's a financial channel. Yes, but I don't have equity channels in my model. So I guess I can be silent about that now, but that's something to explore in the future. I'm pretty sure sovereign bonds market will show up. Okay. But yes, so that's something very interesting. I could check that. Maybe it's for the future paper. Okay, so hopefully by now I've convinced you I have a rather exhaustive central experiment. So using this currency demand shock, we want to understand now how exchange rates are responsive to this currency demand shock and how interest rates are going to move. So with that in mind, I move to the second block of this paper, which I will show you some dynamics in the currency markets on exchange rates and interest rate. So fact number 1, we show that the demand shock moves exchange rates in the short run. So here, I'm showing that this is the vertical axis of exchange rate response in percentage terms, and the horizontal axis are days before and after rebalancing, where time 0, is the rebalancing date. So we show that exchange rates respond significantly to a currency demand shock for the cross-country sample. And this regression counts with day fixed effects. And also we control for country fixed effects with robust standard errors. So apart from the fact that exchange rates are responsive, I think a smart audience like you might have noticed that, okay, why are exchange rates responsive to the shock weeks before the rebalancing occurred time 0? Is this expected, or will this be a problem for my empirical strategy? Well, the answer is no, because first of all, it's extremely expected because the mutual funds investors, managers, they are pretty smart people. When they wake up in the beginning of the month, they typically have an idea about who's going to hit 10% again. So they'll be like, oh, Brazil's going to hit 10% again, and Argentina are more likely to be bring back again, up again, because, you know, the same pattern, you know, this reshuffling algorithm, we can replicate that. So they would have a guess of who's going to decrease the weights and who's going to increase the weights, the direction, right? However, they don't know exactly how much they will rebalance, because that's the mu CT, my currency demand shock, is depending on the price and rebalancing date, and that exactly how much there will be rebalanced is only revealed on the rebalancing date. So that's why you see the exchange rates will keep decreasing. And after time 0, there's no more information effects left on table anymore. So that's why the effects become pretty stable, because there's no more information revealed by the market. The fact that exchange rates responsive to the currency demand shock weeks before the actual balance takes place are consistent with the efficient market hypothesis in finance. And it's precisely because exchange rate response weeks before, we take the entire window That means we take the entire horizon, a few weeks before rebalancing takes place, all the way until you stabilize, as my estimation window for exchange rate elasticity. So I don't just look at the days before not rebalancing. I'm looking at dating all the way back to 25 days, because this is right after last rebalancing occurred, to after rebalancing as my horizon for estimating exchange rate elasticity.
But
okay,
you say
yeah,
it's consistent with the efficient market hypothesis, but here there's no information being revealed about the fundamentals. It's all about, you know, demand shock. So actually, it's indicative of a frictions of limited arbitrage, rather than you know, there's no innovation in, there's no new news about the underlying assets here, as far as I can tell.
Well,
So
for here, I think
it-
here is the information you found. So for example, if Brazil is doing really well, let's say Brazil, let's say I wake up today at the beginning of the month, I saw Brazil's weight is already 11, right? I was like, okay, well, and Brazil's market prices keep booming. Well, that means that very likely in the end of the month, Brazil's going to hit 10%, 10, 15, or even 16%, let's say. Okay, I'm just making these numbers up. So I know that Brazil's market's on trend, and that means that Brazil's hitting 10% again, and Brazil will be rebalanced downwards, and rebalanced downwards by Brazil, this will lead to other countries' weights increase. So that's, I would say, that's a macro fundamental news revealing. That's the efficient market hypothesis. Yeah, I don't know how we see the limited arbitrage here. You are just saying that, okay, I guess you are trying to suggest why don't arbitrageurs arbitrage away the profits on the table if they can, seems like they can make profits out of it, right? Is that your concern, Helen?
Yes, I mean, I'm trying to understand both the path and then the persistence of that shock, right? So there is nothing changed in the fundamentals of the bonds here. So you're telling me that it's purely a kind of friction, two types of friction, or at least one type of friction, maybe two, that are explaining what is happening. One type of friction is that arbitrary rule of 10% or whatever that is, right? Which has nothing to do with the fundamentals of the asset. And the second type of friction, I'm guessing, is some type of, to make it persistent, is some type of, I don't know, limit to arbitrage, or some kind of friction in the, which breaks the UIP condition, essentially. And so I see those results are indicative of frictions in international finance, not of, you know, frictionless market where you learn about an asset price fundamental and the price adjusts and we are done, right? It's completely different.
I see. So we're talking about asset pricing fundamental, not talking about the macro fundamental. So my example, I see. So my example, I just talk about Brazil having a price boom. You think that does not apply to this case? Or maybe I misunderstood you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one has to define quite carefully what you're talking about when you're talking about efficient markets here. Yeah. But it seems to me there are frictions all over the place here in your view of the world, and rightly so.
Okay. Yeah, this is very interesting. Okay. I have some follow-up questions, but maybe I'll ask you after the talk. Yeah, about some reference on that. Thank you.
Sorry,
okay,
just another one, a quick
please.
one. So isn't there a form of mechanical correlation over time in those shocks? Because if you're small in a portfolio, you're going to...
There is correlation, exactly. There's a correlation. And in fact, I think it's this correlation that makes the shock persistent. And that's my next figure. So when I plot the rebalancings, so it's the same as the regression did in the first graph, but now we're looking at days of rebalancing, we just expand the window to months. So we go all the way to 12 months. We see that intervention persistence, well, okay, so this is one shock, right? It does move the exchange rates to this level, but then the shock just stays there for at least 3 to 4 months significant until it finally reverts back to mean, to the original level. And part of the reason that it has the effect so long lasting on exchange rates is mainly, I think, very possible because there's a AR1 coefficient on the persistence of exchange rates. On the innovation, on the currency demand shock, which I don't remember what I reported in the table in the paper, but there's some rather high persistence of AR1 coefficient that leads to this persistent exchange rates. But precisely because exchange rates are persistent, it's actually good for me I actually do want that, because when we talk about intervention policies, when I draw implications to the model, which I'm going to show you in the third block, we don't want a demand shock that's transitory. Because number one, what do we do about prices if prices moves back in 2 days? We want some, persistent effects to speak about policy impacts. And number two, actual intervention happens, they also happens in some period of time, and they do multiple rounds of intervention with some persistence. This is actually refer back to intervention paper in 2019 on JP Macro, where they actually show some statistics by emerging countries intervention episodes, and they show that those interventions happens at a high persistence frequency, and they normally do multiple of them, and one after one with higher correlation. Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
I wonder, in your cross section, do you have so does it happen that you have exchange rates which don't commove vis-a-vis the dollar? So is it like a common factor when you are hitting the 10% for, let's say, Brazil or whatever? Isn't it an indication that you have, US wealth is high somehow? US dollar investors are investing in emerging markets, and effectively that pushes up the exchange rate of everyone. And
yeah, I believe those things will be captured by the time fixed effects, right? I also try to do some robustness check the global financial cycle.
But they are not exposed uniformly, right? So you're going to have heterogeneity in the cross section. If you have a common factor,
I see.
But there's heterogeneity in the exposure, that's going to push up everyone, but to different degrees. So I don't think you are controlling for that. So is it simply what's happening, like, positive wealth shock on US dollar investors, essentially all the exchange rate appreciates, but differentially, and then negative wealth shock, they all depreciates, but differentially as well?
Yeah, that's a possibility. But don't you think that okay? I see. I kind of see your point. So I did control for the time series of dollar global financial cycles, but you're saying that the response of that may be heterogeneous cross countries.
Yeah.
So yeah, I need to, that can be done using like interaction term between between the country regimes. And I need to think about that a bit more, but that's something definitely I should be able to check and easy to fix. Thank you, Helen. This is really golden stuff. Thank you. I feel like I was thinking maybe after job market, you will not be getting many new comments on the paper, but you still do, especially from great research like Helen all the time. It's amazing. Thank you. Okay, so fact 1 and 2, we've shown that exchange rates are responsive to the currency demand shock, both in the short and long run. So another thing, this actually backs to Helen's question earlier, which is about what if the asset prices are responding? Okay, in particular, what if policy rates are responding to the currency demand shock? If they do respond, there will be a huge problem for my identification, because if monetary policy rates are responding to the shock, macro fundamentals will also respond too, and also exchange rates. This will contaminate my identification. However, I assure you this is not the case. So when I check the policy rates from central banks, this is data from BIS, and also the 3-month yield policy rates, the short-term rates and the monetary policy rates are both not responsive to the currency demand shock. So here, just want to get a sense of figure. So I'm drawing the same figure as we had for the exchange rates, but rather than regressing exchange rates change on the shock, I'm regressing policy change on the shock. Okay, and you can see that both of them are not significant. This is for the cross-section. And for the country-specific one, they also do not show up any significancy, which means that we should not worry about policy rates contaminating my identification channel for exchange rates. And finally, this is the last fact, which by knowing that exchange rates are responsive to the shock and interest rates are not, we want to take a further look to understand if there's heterogeneity across countries on the exchange response to the shock. Okay, so here I'm doing a country-specific regression. Okay, so I guess perhaps here, if the dollar factor really have heterogeneous impact on the country, it will show up. So we're doing the country-specific regression, but also with time fixed effects. So basically, what I'm estimating is country-specific betas. which is how much would a country-specific exchange rates respond to the currency demand shock in this country. So we do find heterogeneous impacts coefficients for different currencies, and we want to understand what leads to this heterogeneity. So we plot those country-specific response against different macro metrics, such as inflation, consumption, GDP, and M2 supply. None of them have any clear patterns whatsoever, but there's only one metric that really shows up strongly correlated with the country-specific response, and that is the exchange rate regimes or the volatility exchange rates. So here I'm plotting the country-specific response on the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is the regimes of exchange rates classified by exactly range hieroglyph, all the way from de facto peg to free floating. And you see a very clear downward sloping pattern that the more floating the regimes are, the larger the response of the exchange rates to the currency demand shock, and also the larger the volatility exchange rates, which is given by the size of the circle. So again, this means that when they have larger response, that means that the markets are more inelastic, because when markets are inelastic, that will mean that the asset prices are responsive to the flow.
But so isn't it the fact that if you know a country is pegging, you, as a market participant, you do expect that, if the exchange rate moves, the central bank is just going to intervene. So you expect that. And if
you do expect that, but okay, so
credibility, that's gonna, that's just gonna stabilize the exchange rate.
I understand your point.
That's another story, but yeah.
So there's two things that going on. I understand the question, Helen. So first of all, this is exogenous currency demand shock. We have comments, and secondly, I do try to regress government interventions, which I have data on that. Interventions, I regress the government interventions also on the currency demand shock, and they do not show any significance. So I guess that's the key to answer your question. So when you regress government interventions on a currency demand shock, they have no correlation at all. Well, whether government intervention data are quality, how good is that? That's a different question, right? But the point is that the data shows that the government, they're not using government interventions, no monetary policy rates, which is from the FOX 3. They're not using any of these two instruments to actively offsetting the exchange rate impact from a currency demand shock. So that means that what I'm estimating here is a purely exogenous demand shock on exchange rates that's independent of macro fundamentals and also interventions from the government.
Okay,
that's
but it is totally possible that the government doesn't have to intervene if it's credible and people believe that there would be an intervention if there would be a big deviation. So actually, you don't see it in the quantities, but it's still the case that the exchange rate is credibly pegged, right? So if I have an exogenous change in currency demand, which puts some demand pressure, but I expect that if the exchange rate depreciates, there's going to be an intervention that will bring it back, and it's credible, then I won't trade on this unless I really want to do a speculative back on the peg, which happens once in a while, but not so in other words, you don't need to observe the quantity if change if the peg is credible. So it stabilizes the currency without any intervention. So that's in the expectation of the markets, essentially. We do have that would deliver this. And and this is the famous, power of the central bankers. Like, think about the Draghi stabilizing without intervention episode in 2012 with the interest rate. That's the equivalent for the exchange rate. So
sorry, that's a very good point. Yeah, I believe Oleg has told me about this before. He also, anyway, in his paper, he also, I'm just referring to Soki Muking's Musa Redux, the optimal exchange policy paper, the new paper, which they have talked about different possible ways. It's credible peg, right? And also intervention from government, also monetary policy. So there are all different ways to stabilize exchange rates. So I think what you're really referring to is that I think I need to impose more structure on how my currency demand shock differs from the intervention from the government. That's my understanding. So I think, I'm not sure if I have it in the slides, but in the paper, I try to put in, the way I write down government's intervention is that it's a function of no trader shocks, it offsets dual traded shocks, plus some surprises, which are so-called unanticipated interventions. So what I'm claiming is that my currency demand shock matches the unanticipated component in that government intervention. So it's not it's completely like unanticipated from the government agents. So it's not a component that actually you would expect the government to stabilize exchange rates from on a day-to-day basis. So this is dual traded shocks, which I'm going to see in the model. This is dual traded shocks. I agree with that. They do create exchange rate wedges, URP wedges. But it's somehow, I don't know why, this is not outside the scope of this paper, the government does not really step in to intervene with it. They just choose to not do anything about it and let it create URP wedge. And precisely because they are not doing that, that makes me able to do my empirical setting to match it to model. That's my understanding to that. Okay, I have no idea how much time I have actually, because I was told I have like an hour, like roughly.
Yeah, you have another 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yes, so I think I have time to talk about the model, but if there's any questions, please let me know before I move on to the next block.
Yes. I just have a quick question.
Sure.
Do you look at all at volumes traded at all during the span, like in those 28 days before the intervention? Like, is it all a big spike just on that day of intervention, or is there lots of anticipation by the
Yeah, that's a great question. You're talking about tradings in the exchange rate market or in mutual funds, or
the exchange rate market, if the data.
Yeah, so I believe I don't have the daily frequency of exchange rates, but when I look at the monthly frequency of trading, so definitely that shows up as so how can I say that? When I try to map the coefficient, let's say, the response of exchange rates to the currency demand shock, so that things definitely correlate with the trading. I think that I have that figure in the paper, but not here in the slides. Well, it makes sense. The more liquid the market is, they probably have some market risk recorded with volatility exchange rates and also the coefficients. I'm going to capture response. But how much daily? I don't have a daily frequency on the trading. So, yeah, I don't know how that's going to change in response on a small interval of how the exchange rate is going to change as a result of currency demand shock. But in an aggregate macro level, the volume of the trading that correlates with the country-specific response of exchange rates to the shock. Yes, that's something. Thanks for asking that. Okay, so we didn't take this. Okay, so let's stop for a second and see what we have seen here. So we see this currency demand shock moves exchange rates, both in short and long run. And then this interest rate who does not respond. We also show that there are heterogeneous responses across currency regimes driven by the volatility exchange rates or the regimes of exchange rates, right? So that's the 4 facts we have seen. So now let's put it together into a model to rationalize what it means. So here I'm going to a very simple model, just 2 equations. So just bear with me, 2 equations. So here is position arbitrage holdings of currency C. So on the right-hand side, we have URP deviations, and we have exogenous currency demand shock. Exogenous URP shock. So when I say exogenous URP shock, I simply mean that those are the shocks that create return differentials on the currencies without alternating the equilibrium allocation of assets and exchange rates. So here, the mu's, the phi CT are the risk premium shocks on the macroeconomy, and the tau CT are, think of them as the capital control taxes. So both of them are just act on return differentials, but not alternating the equilibrium allocation of assets in the market. The risk bearer capacity, that's the lambda CT here, is modeled as a function of exchange rate volatility, sigma squared, and omega. That's the risk aversion capacity arbitrage. Why can we model the risk aversion capacity as a function of volatility exchange rates? So that's exactly from fact number 4, right? Because we see that how much exchange rates are responsible to currency demand shock will be a function of volatility exchange rates. And this will be more clear from the next equation, which introduces market clearing condition. We'll have 4 agents in the economy. They are the households. So the market is segmented that the home household can only hold home bonds and foreign household can only hold foreign bonds. And then there's intervention from the government side, and then we have no traders, and then we have arbitrageurs in the market. So both interventions, no traders, and arbitrageurs, they can both hold home and foreign currency. So if you plug in the first equation to the second one, you can rewrite the URP equation in this way, in that the change of exchange rates, expected returns, equals interest differentials, plus, the risk premium shock or capital control shock, and plus this whole term is simply my arbitrageurs holdings, right? Times the risk-bearing capacity arbitrageurs. And following SOP move in 2024, we try to call this whole term the endogenous URP shock. Okay, I know some people don't like this name, but what it really simply means is that this is the component URP where a change in arbitrageurs holdings will lead to trigger equilibrium response endogenously on exchange rates and the risk-bearing capacity arbitrageurs that then leads to URP deviations in equilibrium. Because both lambda CT here, which is the risk-bearing capacity, depends on volatility exchange rates, which is equilibrium objects. So therefore, whenever there's a change in no traders positions, it will trigger responses in exchange rates. And what we're estimating in the model, in empirical data early on, is simply the lambda CT, which is the risk-bearing capacity arbitrageurs. So what Helene was basically saying is that, what if macro fundamentals, okay, and government interventions, this is my F here, what if these two things are also doing something to offset no trader shocks from the government, from the industry balancings? This would make my identification not valid at all, right? And I agree with that. But so we show that empirically that we check the interventions data at the monthly frequency. This is the most, and also we try some daily frequencies, which is the best data we can have on IMF, regression on the MUCT, and none of them show up significantly. Okay, which means that the government are not using monetary policy, that's fact number 3, nor interventions from the government to offset no trader shocks actively. Meaning, and also macro fundamentals, of course, do not respond to no trader shocks because it's the slow moving objects, and currency demand shock are pretty high frequency. So in other words, what we're really estimating in the empirical setting early on, we identified the no trader response to the currency demand shock in this lambda CT are essentially what you would need to do counterfactually in the model for an intervention F to offset no trader shocks to stabilize exchange rates all the way to 0. In other words, by estimating lambda CT, we can back out counterfactual required size and intervention to move exchange rates. So I think let me finish in 2 minutes and we can maybe take questions, because I think I only have like 2 slides left. So in the last slide, I want to just talk about, so what have you learned from this model? So how does it relate to the really hot topic now called the relaxed trilemma? So what's relaxed trilemma, first of all? Well, it differs from what we learned in a traditional textbook, the Mandel-Fleming trilemma, which says that you can only choose 2 of the 3 things, right? Everyone learned this in undergrad. So here, this relaxed trilemma saying, okay, in fact, you can have the 3 things together, all possible, which is independent monetary policy, the free capital flow, mobility, and then also the exchange rates that's managed. Well, and our empirical evidence that interventions are actually effective and move exchange rates exactly provide empirical evidence for relaxed trilemma. Why? Because now, since markets are inelastic, interventions can now serve as additional policy instrument to move exchange rates, and we do not rely on monetary policy at all. This is fact number 3. And we also do not really put any restrictions on the capital mobility of taxes. In other words, intervention can work effectively to move exchange rates regardless of capital control policies and independent monetary policies, relaxing the trilemma constraint. In other words, the fact that the markets are inelastic, in fact, are exactly are the key to supporting trilemma does not hold, or in other words, it invalidates the classical trilemma and supports the relaxed trilemma. So here, I just want to draw like a Venn diagram, which this whole red circle is where UIP does not hold. But when UIP does not hold, it does not mean that trilemma does not hold, because trilemma does not hold needs to financial markets being inelastic. And we need only the endogenous UIP shocks from arbitrageurs holdings channels. This is the only type of shock of UIP deviation that can lead to trilemma also does not hold. And this makes intervention effective. Okay. And this is the literature we're standing on, in a sense that this is a new strong literature in recent years, including the vast majority and Soki Muking, and also a serious paper by Gopinas and co-authors, which propose that financial markets are inelastic, and this endogenous UIP shocks through the UIP, through the arbitrageurs holdings channel. This is the only type of model that can work, that can be consistent with evidence of relaxed trilemma condition and inelastic financial markets. So to conclude, we have this, the estimation results that exactly as what we expect from the model. We show that the floaters, where the volatility is much larger, they have a much more effective intervention, in a sense that the required intervention size are 3 times smaller for Africa compared to Peru, because South Africa is a free floater and Peru is a packer. As well as the models, because whenever you are packing exchange rates, the volatility exchange rates will be 0, meaning that arbitrageurs have infinite risk-bearing capacity, and therefore they don't need to put any currency risk. And we're back to the classical trilemma where intervention does not work. So it's only when you have limited risk-bearing capacity that's key to generate this friction that leads to endogenous UIP deviation and therefore financial markets being inelastic. Okay, to conclude, so we use a well-identified currency demand shock, the exogenous to shift the currency composition of government bonds in the economy. We show that exchange rates are responsive to the currency demand shock both in the short and long run, and have heterogeneous responses across currencies. We identified the required size intervention to stabilize exchange rates through a segmented financial markets model. The results are important to strengthen literature in macro finance and also to policymakers and central banks.